Something unprecedented is happening inside the Trump financial empire right now, and it is not coming from external regulators or political opponents. For the first time since Donald Trump returned to the White House, the institutional architecture that has sustained his business operations for decades is beginning to show structural cracks that cannot be papered over with legal maneuvers or political leverage. Court judgments and financial obligations are colliding as creditors, bondholders, and regulatory bodies step in to address what some financial analysts are calling an unsustainable debt structure. This is not just about business setbacks or temporary cash flow problems. It is about the fundamental question of whether a business empire built on leverage, brand licensing, and perpetual refinancing can survive when legal judgments, political exposure, and market forces converge simultaneously. Stay until the end because what is unfolding here could reshape not only Trump's personal financial position, but also the regulatory framework governing conflicts of interest for future presidents. And if you want to stay informed as these developments continue to accelerate, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because we are tracking every financial filing, every court decision, and every strategic move as this situation develops in real time. So imagine this moment late last week in New York, London, and Washington simultaneously. Financial advisors reviewing balance sheets that no longer balance. Attorneys checking court dockets twice because the accumulation of judgments has reached levels that exceed available liquid assets. Creditors quietly coordinating among themselves because they understand that in situations where assets cannot cover obligations, timing determines who recovers and who does not because someone inside the Trump Organization financial team has apparently concluded that the risk of continued exposure has become greater than the risk of strategic restructuring. And for the first time in decades, the usual pattern of extend, refinance, and delay is encountering obstacles that money and political influence cannot simply overcome. And that is where the real danger to any highly leveraged empire always begins. Because right now, documents are circulating among financial institutions and legal teams that reveal the true scope of obligations facing the Trump Organization as it attempts to operate under the unprecedented circumstance of having its principal owner serving as President of the United States. And no, this is not just about the civil fraud judgment in New York or the defamation verdicts that have generated headlines. This is something far more structurally destabilizing because it involves the convergence of legal judgments totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, bond obligations coming due on properties with declining valuations, and the operational reality that many of the Trump Organization's most valuable assets are not actually owned properties, but licensing agreements that depend entirely on brand value and counterparty willingness to maintain relationships. And the reason this convergence matters is not just that it represents significant financial pressure or even potential insolvency for specific entities within the corporate structure. It is that financial institutions themselves, the lenders and bondholders who have extended credit based on asset valuations and income projections, are beginning to recalculate their risk exposure. And when that happens, when the baseline assumptions that justified lending terms start to shift, credit markets do not respond with patient accommodation. They respond with what we are seeing right now: margin calls, covenant violations, and the kind of creditor coordination that precedes major restructuring or liquidation events. Because at the heart of this entire financial crisis is a simple but consequential reality. Donald Trump has always operated his business empire as if debt is infinite, as if refinancing is always available, as if brand value alone can substitute for actual cash flow when obligations come due. And this approach worked for decades in real estate development, where property appreciation covered leverage, where new lenders could be found to pay off old lenders, where bankruptcy protection provided escape routes when specific ventures failed. But in the presidency, where financial disclosure is mandatory and conflicts of interest generate constant scrutiny, this model becomes systemically vulnerable. And financial professionals know this. They understand that once a business empire demonstrates that its cash flow cannot cover its obligations, that its asset values depend on subjective brand assessments rather than objective income generation, that its principal is subject to legal judgments that can pierce corporate structures and reach personal guarantees, the entire valuation framework collapses because lenders price credit based on probability of repayment, and those probabilities depend on reliable information about cash flow, asset quality, and legal exposure. When that information reveals obligations that exceed assets, when income projections prove optimistic, when legal judgments keep mounting, every credit agreement across every entity simultaneously becomes suspect. And that realization, spreading through financial institutions at the speed of credit committee meetings, is what generates the kind of coordinated creditor response that typically precedes major financial restructuring. Now, this is not the first time concerns have emerged about Trump Organization financial stability. There were the casino bankruptcies of the 1990s. There were the struggles to refinance Deutsche Bank loans that other institutions refused to touch. There was the pattern of inflating asset values for lending purposes while deflating them for tax purposes, the practice that ultimately resulted in the New York civil fraud judgment. But what makes this moment different, what elevates it from familiar pattern to immediate crisis, is the combination of massive legal judgments, the political impossibility of declaring bankruptcy while serving as president, and the market reality that the Trump brand itself, the primary asset in many licensing agreements, has become politically polarizing in ways that reduce rather than enhance commercial value. Because the New York civil fraud judgment alone exceeds $400 million with interest. The defamation verdicts add another 90 million. There are outstanding legal fees from multiple cases. There are bond obligations on properties that may be worth less than the debt they carry. These are not abstract liabilities or contingent obligations. These are immediate cash requirements that must be met through asset sales, refinancing, or external capital injection. And when those requirements exceed available liquidity, when assets cannot be sold quickly without significant discounts, when lenders prove unwilling to extend additional credit against collateral of uncertain value, the options narrow dramatically. And this is where the concept of leverage becomes critical to understanding why this moment feels so precarious to the people who actually manage large scale real estate portfolios. Because real estate investors operate with constant awareness of debt service coverage ratios, of loan to value covenants, of the relationship between cash flow and obligations. They remember the commercial real estate crisis of 2008, the savings and loan failures of the 1980s, the pattern through which over-leveraged empires collapse when refinancing becomes impossible. They understand that real estate wealth is not self-liquidating. Property rich does not mean cash rich. Assets that look substantial on balance sheets can become burdens rather than resources when they must be sold quickly to meet obligations. And that understanding, that recognition of how leverage magnifies both gains and losses, is what makes the Trump Organization's current position appear so vulnerable to professionals who analyze these situations. When a property portfolio carries debt that approaches or exceeds market value, when income from operations barely covers interest payments, when legal judgments require immediate cash that can only come from asset sales or new borrowing, the mathematical reality is stark. Either lenders extend additional credit against weakening collateral, or assets must be liquidated in sequence determined by which creditors have strongest legal position and greatest urgency. And neither option preserves the empire in its current form. Both represent forms of dismantling, whether managed through strategic restructuring or forced through creditor action and court supervision. This internal calculation is fueled by a broader concern that Trump's approach to his business empire is no longer primarily commercial, but primarily political. When he uses properties as venues for political events, when foreign governments book rooms to curry favor, when business decisions get made based on political loyalty rather than financial return, it signals a model in which the business exists to serve political ambition rather than generate sustainable profit. That model terrifies lenders and partners who understand that once business operations become subordinate to political calculations, once properties are valued for access they provide rather than income they generate, once management decisions prioritize loyalty over competence, the financial sustainability that justified original lending terms simply evaporates. This anxiety has turned routine refinancing conversations into difficult negotiations, standard covenant compliance into potential trigger events, and normal creditor relationships into adversarial positioning as each institution tries to protect its exposure while the overall situation deteriorates. And financial professionals observe this even if they rarely speak publicly, because they understand that commercial relationships depend on discretion and that public criticism of prominent clients carries reputational risk. But privately, in credit committee meetings and risk assessment reviews, they are asking the same questions. Can the Trump organization generate sufficient cash flow to meet its obligations? Are asset valuations realistic given current market conditions and brand polarization? Does the president's political position create legal exposure that exceeds the protection corporate structures are designed to provide? And once those questions move from theoretical concern to operational reality, the credit terms change. Interest rates rise to reflect increased risk. Covenants tighten to provide earlier warning of distress. Lenders quietly coordinate to ensure they understand the full scope of obligations and can act collectively if intervention becomes necessary. And that coordination, happening in conference rooms far from political rallies and press conferences, represents the real financial pressure that no amount of political success can eliminate. Because bond obligations come due regardless of election results. Court judgments must be paid regardless of presidential immunity arguments. Creditors have legal rights that persist regardless of who occupies the White House. All of this is happening against a backdrop of unprecedented legal exposure that extends beyond business operations into personal liability. There are the criminal cases in multiple jurisdictions. There are the civil suits from January 6th participants and police officers. There are the defamation claims and the sexual assault verdicts. There are investigations into whether government resources were used to benefit private business interests. Into this already complex situation comes the reality that serving as president while managing a business empire creates daily conflicts that generate new legal exposure even as old cases proceed toward judgment. The timing creates perfect vulnerability. An empire that might survive legal judgments if it could focus entirely on financial management instead must operate while its principal is consumed by presidential duties. A business structure that might weather financial pressure if it faced no legal judgments instead must generate cash for legal settlements while trying to refinance debt and maintain operations. And the convergence, the simultaneous pressure from legal obligations and financial constraints while trying to govern a country is what makes this moment feel qualitatively different from the previous business crises that Trump survived through delay, bankruptcy, and refinancing. And while the immediate focus remains on specific legal judgments and debt obligations, a quieter, more systemic pressure is building beneath the surface. Because every time Trump uses presidential office to promote his properties, every time foreign governments book rooms at his hotels, every time business decisions get made in the White House that could affect his financial interests, it inadvertently creates documentary evidence for future legal challenges about whether he violated emoluments clauses, whether he abused presidential authority for personal gain, whether conflicts of interest rose to the level of impeachable conduct. These are not abstract constitutional questions. These are potential sources of additional legal liability that could generate more judgments, more financial obligations, more pressure on an empire already struggling to meet current requirements. And the accumulation, the adding of new potential liabilities while existing obligations remain unmet, is what transforms manageable financial pressure into potential cascade failure. This brings us back to why financial analysts are treating this situation with unusual concern. They can see the pattern that political observers might miss because they understand how leverage works, how credit markets respond to stress, how over-leveraged empires collapse. They watch court judgments exceed available cash. They see asset values decline while debt remains fixed. They observe lenders becoming cautious and refinancing becoming difficult, and they recognize these as warning signs that historically precede major financial restructuring. They understand that this is not just about whether Trump survives this particular court judgment or whether specific properties must be sold. It is a systems test, one that asks whether a business empire built on leverage and brand value can survive when legal judgments must be paid, when refinancing becomes impossible, when the brand itself becomes liability rather than asset. Because financial markets do not operate on loyalty or political power. They operate on mathematics. And the mathematics of over-leveraged real estate facing legal judgments while generating insufficient cash flow is unforgiving regardless of who owns the properties. For observers watching this situation develop, the temptation is to treat it as just another chapter in Trump's history of financial drama, followed by survival. But that would miss the crucial difference this time. Because the real question is not whether Trump has survived financial pressure before or whether he understands how to use bankruptcy protection strategically. The real question is whether those strategies remain available when he serves as president, when bankruptcy would create constitutional crisis, when asset sales might violate emoluments clauses, when refinancing requires disclosure of terms that could reveal foreign entanglements or conflicts of interest. And that question does not belong to financial analysts alone. It belongs to anyone concerned about whether constitutional provisions governing presidential conflicts of interest can be enforced, whether the republic can function when its chief executive faces financial pressures that might influence policy decisions, whether democratic governance is compatible with a president whose personal financial survival depends on relationships with foreign governments and domestic creditors who have business before the federal government. And as this financial crisis continues, as obligations come due and asset sales become necessary, and as the gap between political success and financial sustainability becomes impossible to ignore, the outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy stands when personal interest conflicts with public duty, not in theory, but in practice, not in constitutional text or legal precedent, but in the lived reality of whether a president can be compelled to divest conflicting interests when he refuses, whether courts can enforce judgments against someone who controls the executive branch, whether financial pressure can force transparency that political power wants to conceal. Because democratic institutions do not protect themselves. They rely on enforcement mechanisms willing to function even when the subject of enforcement occupies the highest office, on financial institutions willing to treat presidential debtors according to standard credit practices rather than political calculation, on legal systems capable of compelling compliance from defendants who control significant governmental power. And that enforcement, quiet or dramatic, is the real story unfolding behind the financial headlines. One that will be written not by political positioning or public relations, but by the choices creditors make when obligations exceed assets, by the decisions courts make when judgments must be collected, by the reality of whether law applies equally when the debtor is also the president. So if you found this analysis valuable and want to continue following how this unprecedented financial situation develops at the intersection of business empire and presidential power, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is accelerating toward resolution points that will define both Trump's financial future and the constitutional boundaries of presidential conflicts of interest for generations to come.